wait till like 1 minute.
Okay.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Marcia Henry. I'm a legal editor with Clearinghouse Review. We anticipate a really interesting discussion today by a great group of panelists on questions that are important to the legal aid community about the connections between anti-poverty work and racial justice work, and whether anti-poverty work can be really complete without using a racial justice lens. We got to the decision to hold this webinar after a survey of advocates a few months ago turned up differing perspectives on this and other questions within the legal aid community, and you'll be hearing more about that in a few minutes. And hence the title of our webinar, Are We Full of Contradictions? Legal Aid Programs and Racial Justice Advocacy. First, just a few housekeeping items. If you have any technical problems, Catherine is standing by to help you. You can call her at 312-368-1104, the number on this slide. We are very interested in getting both your questions and your comments, so please type those into the box on the panel on the right side of your screen. We'll be monitoring them throughout the webinar, and depending on how time goes, we'll try to address some both at the end of each presentation as well as at the end of the webinar. I also want to mention that we're doing a little experiment today. We're trying out the video feature of GoToWebinar. That's our first time doing this. We hope that you'll find it helpful and more engaging to be able to see presenters as well as to hear them. And we're interested in any feedback you have about this feature. You can adjust the placement of the video frames by clicking on the little arrow at the top left of your screen. That gives a drop-down menu that allows you to position the video frames, and you can also hide them entirely if you find them distracting. So feel free to use that. And then an archive of the webinar will be up, it should be up tomorrow. Will include both audio and slides as well as some other resources related to this topic, and you'll receive that link in an email after the webinar. I'd like to first say a few words about Clearinghouse Review. We're in our 47th year of publication. It's published bi-monthly by the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law. This image that you're seeing is the cover of our current September-October issue, which focuses entirely on racial justice advocacy. It is up on our website now. Hard copies will be wending their way to subscribers in the mail in the next couple of weeks. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I'll say more about what's in it toward the end of the webinar. The Shriver Center, from its base in Chicago, works nationally using law as a tool to help low-income people achieve social and economic justice. And in addition to advocacy and communication programs, under Communication, Clearinghouse Review is the primary vehicle. The Shriver Center has a training component that will be launching next year, a Racial Justice Training Institute. The idea behind that is to help legal aid lawyers and other racial justice advocates hone their skills in that area, and the special issue of Clearinghouse Review will be a resource for that institute. It will probably begin in mid-May with an in-person component in probably the early June. The calendar will be up next month, so watch for more information about that. It will be a 7-month program that will include both online and in-person components. Now, we at the Shriver Center, along with the nation as a whole, of course, are observing the 50th anniversaries of many iconic moments from the civil rights movement, ranging from the Transcendent, the March on Washington in August, to the horrific, just not even 3 weeks later, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And that, of course, has gotten the attention, all these anniversaries of many advocates and others. Next year, we'll also be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. The Shriver Center's roots are there. We were founded as the National Clearinghouse for Legal Services, founded by Sergeant Shriver as part of the Office of Economic Opportunity. And in 2017, we'll be celebrating our own 50th anniversary. And as we contemplate all these anniversaries, it's clear that understanding how poverty and racism exacerbate each other and yet are really distinct phenomena is an ongoing effort. We need to think deeply about whether these struggles are the same, whether they're separate, and those are the questions that we'll be digging into today. I'd now like to introduce Carol Ashley, who's the Shriver Center's Vice President of Advocacy. Carol comes to us after a long career as a civil rights lawyer, and she will be both participating as a panelist and moderating the discussion among our panelists today. So, Carol?
Good afternoon, everyone. Assuming you are in our time zone. I just want to give you an idea of where we're going to go with the webinar today. Camille Holmes from NLADA, the National Legal Aid and Defender Association, will present survey results and implications from those survey results on a survey that they conducted, really asking legal aid community members about their work with racial justice and their thoughts about it. I will cover the relationship between advocacy and diversity in legal service type organizations and anti-poverty legal organizations. Bill Kennedy will show us and talk to us about actual examples from his work at the Legal Services of Northern California, where they have engaged racial justice work for several years now. And then Marcia will come back and she will discuss some of the highlights of the Clearinghouse Review special issue. Just a little bit about Camille. Camille serves as the Director of Leadership and Race Equity for NLADA. She works to expand race equity as a core strategy nationally, regionally, and locally in public, defense, and civil legal aid organizations. Bill Kennedy is the managing attorney for Legal Services of Northern California. I would call him a litigator's litigator. He works in areas of housing, civil rights, and the nexus between those two areas. He's also one of the architects of the Race and Equity Project, which he will discuss, which seeks to put tools of race-conscious advocacy in the hands of community activists. So now I will turn the reins over to Camille, and she will present the survey results.
Great. Hello, everyone. I am, you can let me know if there's any issues seeing the slide, but I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. It's been a really interesting journey working with the folks on Clearinghouse on this issue related to racial justice and racial equity. And the survey that we put together, Fran Fajana and myself, really came about by us asking the question. There's been at least 10, maybe 12 concentrated years of creating the space to talk about race and poverty in legal services. And we were wondering, how is that actually sinking in? Is it something that, a few people are doing and a lot of people are sort of not really clear about? Is it, where does that show up and how does it show up in legal services and what does that mean? And so we actually, we conducted the survey in May and June of 2013, emailed to folks in NLADA's database. Over 1,450 folks received individual emails, and then we also circulated a web link where if you wanted to participate in the survey or you knew people who wanted to, they could click on that link. We had about 330 people actually complete the survey. Those folks came from throughout the equal justice community, but they were predominantly staff and management from legal services organizations. They also included 52 directors of the 134 LSC-funded programs, and I just thought that was a nice set of folks to include. Sorry. The respondents by role. 24% of the people who responded were executive director level. 20% were staff attorneys. Another 24 also in management, supervising attorney 11, and you'll see it goes down from there. And by race, about 74% of the respondents were white, 13% were black, 6.2% are Asian, 1.6% were Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and 1.2% were American Indian or Alaskan Native. And so I'll start with the good news, or at least from my perspective. We asked a number of questions in the survey, and it was a long survey. I will say that it was not, if I have my social scientist friends come around and sort of give me the critique, I don't think that it was certainly not passed through the level of rigor that those folks might use. However, it had 42 questions, had a number of questions that asked what kind of work people were doing, but it also had questions that talked about what perspectives people had about racial justice, about what legal services organizations should be doing with regard to racial justice, and how race and poverty are linked. And we thought that those answers were actually the most interesting for the article that we were writing. There's still a lot of data to be crunched in the survey, but those are the answers that we're going to focus on. And before I even get into the survey data, I think I want to say why this is important. And I think it's important because this is titled, you know, are we contradicting ourselves? And the answer to that is, of course we are. We're human. We're going to, part of the way that we learn is that we figure out, okay, this is what I really mean, this is what I really understand, and then once we have information that confirms that we either know what we're talking about, or it confirms that we actually have more questions to ask, we can ask those questions. And so what's exciting to me about this dialogue that we're hoping to continue and stoke is that we can look at some of the answers and responses to these questions, and we can ask more questions and really get underneath what it means for legal services community to engage in racial justice in a strategic and in a consistent way, such that we can develop strategies across the board that are actually achieving the results that we're hoping to get in our daily work. So on to the questions. One of the questions was, legal services organizations have a role to play. 88% of everyone who responded agreed or strongly agreed. Breaking down by race, that was very consistent. Actually, the highest agreement was among whites, and it sort of trailed down over across other racial groups and ethnic groups. I forgot to mention that 93.5% of the folks that responded were not Hispanic, leaving 6.5% of the respondents being Hispanic. And I'll move to the next question. The next question was, addressing poverty will address race, and really it's a statement. And people could agree with that statement, disagree, or neither. Among those who responded in the legal services community, 42% either strongly agreed or agreed.
Oh dear, we lost.
Everyone, this is Carol Ashley. Since Camille is having some technical difficulties.
Oh, okay. You know what? I can't talk to her. I'm on a work call.
We will take over the presentation for now and then go back to Camille. So I'm just getting to my slides. Okay. So the area that I was going to cover today dealt with
Hi, Carol.
racial...
I'm back. It looks like my phone dropped or something like that. So just...
Okay, we'll switch back to you then.
Great. Great, and please let me know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Great, thank you. Okay, good. So I was saying that the implications of this we can't say for sure, but there are questions that we need to ask because folks who study racial justice and study racial equity say that in order to address racism, you really do have to put racism in the center of the analysis. It doesn't mean, and there's an intersection, racism happens at lots of different levels across for low-income people and for people who are higher income. And so in that intersection of racism and poverty, there may be different strategies that need to be taken. However, I'd be really interested to get an understanding of what some of the thoughts are, reasoning behind folks who have the thought that addressing poverty will address racism, because we'll learn something about where the disconnects in terms are in terms of our understandings of the issue. And when we learn something about those disconnects, we can then come together to work more effectively together and to develop better strategies to help people of all races who are in poverty address their issues. Great. I wanted to note here that among LSC funded directors, they were actually more likely than the general respondent population to disagree with this statement and less likely to agree with it, which I thought was interesting. Just something to note. Another question. Legal services organizations are doing racial justice when they serve people of color. Among this, 42% agreed with this statement, 34% neither agreed nor disagreed, and 24% strongly disagreed or disagreed. And you again find a difference across racial groups. 44% of whites who responded to the survey agreed that legal services organizations are doing racial justice when they serve people of color. 46% of blacks disagreed. You find among Asians that, or people of Asian descent, that 55% agreed with this statement, and then it goes back around among multiracial folks. The highest number was that they neither agree nor disagree. And then among Latinos and or Hispanics, you find that most disagree with that statement. Is that the right? Yeah, but it's more even. And we had a good comment on this question. I think it could have been a little bit more clear, but one of the comments said that because of the interplay of language and immigration status and the challenges that people face just getting into the door, part of your racial justice advocacy strategy to make some type of longer-term impact for a particular community may involve the access portion of just serving a particular group that is underserved. And I think that may be where some of the differences are, but there are a lot of interesting questions to ask just based on the variances in the answers to this question. Another statement that we put forward that people could agree or disagree with was that I believe people should be colorblind. 55% of the community strongly disagreed or disagreed with the statement. 23% strongly agreed and agreed. You break it down by race, and 53% of whites agreed, 62% disagreed, 62% of blacks, 60% of Asians, 75% of multiracial, and 57% of Hispanics or Latinos strongly disagreed with the statement that I believe people should be colorblind. And so this is another space where there's a distance between the perception of what I'll call people of color and whites in that. There's also, it's notable, 26% of blacks agreed with the statement that people should be colorblind, as did 20% of Asians, and a percentage over here, looks like 19% on Hispanics and Latinos. So there's a lot to discuss, and I think that we can learn from one another. Color blindness is something that's discussed in the article, and something that is well worth a look, I think, for our community to talk about what does it mean to actually be colorblind. I posit, and I think a number of scholars and others will offer that colorblindness is actually avoiding the issue of race. Even though it sounds attractive, it may call to mind sort of thoughts of being judged by the content of our character and Martin Luther King's speech, but it's actually missing the piece that allows us to engage in how race impacts us and what it is that we need to do to impact the real harm that people who are of color are experiencing based on that color. So an interesting note as well, and I'm wrapping up here, is that in response to the question, I believe people should be colorblind, there was a significant difference by age. And the older you are, the more likely you will agree with the statement that people should be colorblind. And I think that probably tracks based on sort of our history, but it would provide some interesting conversation when you're doing your intergenerational dialogues in your offices on how people may be coming from very different perspectives and when they're trying to address problems. And if one person really thinks that colorblindness is an important and deeply held value, and the other person finds it something that's more akin to racism, that is going to interfere in our ability to develop coherent strategies and collective action within the organization itself to advance racial justice issues. So the last piece that I will say, and I think I'm at time, is another note on the survey was that we asked what kind of training people provide. And what was fascinating, and it looked a little off on this slide, but 54%, only 54% of those who responded provide training on poverty. And I think we certainly need training on what poverty is and why people are poor at 100% if folks are working in organizations that are working with poor communities or have an anti-poverty approach. What I noted that for issues of inclusion or intersectionality, I think inclusion is at 16%, only 3% talk about this concept of intersectionality, 17% implicit bias, and so we need to start looking at some of the data and the types of issues and concepts that are actually going to help us to move through racial justice work beyond cultural competence, beyond diversity, and certainly including poverty. So I'll stop there. We'll have time for more conversation, but thank you for your time.
Hi, everyone. I'm just pulling my slides up. Just getting to my point in the slides, everyone. So if we're going to talk about racial justice work at legal service organizations or anti-poverty organizations, I think it becomes imperative to also talk about racial equity and racial diversity within these organizations in terms of staff and board members. I think that some organizations are particularly good at creating racially diverse staffs and boards, and I think there are some organizations where more work needs to be done, and folks are hungry to sort of talk about how they can increase their racial diversity amongst their staff. So we're going to seek to answer two questions today. One is, why does racial justice work matter for LSC and anti-poverty organizations? And then the second question, will more racial diversity in LSC and anti-poverty organization leadership and staffing foster more racial justice work? I think when we're talking about racial justice in environments, it's important to think about what happens when racial justice is not a part of the discussion or the work. One consequence of this is that clients themselves are devalued. If you work with a population that is predominantly persons of color, and they are not seeing people like themselves doing the advocacy work, I think over time there's an internalization of just trying to understand, why is that? Why don't people who look like me do this work? And I think it mirrors their experiences in other organizations, whether it be a government agency that they're dealing with, whether it's their employer, but the notion that, again, they're seeing not themselves in leadership roles and roles of change, but just as people who are being helped. And I think over time that does really create some feelings of internalized racism and just an awkward feeling altogether. If you are not dealing with racial justice, you may not be addressing all of your clients' needs or creating remedies and solutions that address all of the problems. I think Bill Kennedy, when he talks about the work that his organization is doing, you will see some examples of this, that had they not looked at the racial question, they really would have missed the ball, so to speak, on some major issues. When we talk about not addressing racial justice in our work, I really think we are failing to fulfill one of the goals of the war on poverty. Sergeant Shriver and the other architects of the war on poverty were very clear in their messages that this was about empowering communities, that people should be able to change their own lives. And if the people who are working in the anti-poverty organizations don't reflect the communities that they work in, there's a real disconnect. And I think that that empowerment piece is lost. If racial justice is not part of the work, I think there's also this climate issue that develops. Staff members and board members who are from racially diverse backgrounds may struggle to understand their organizational mission and disengage from it. And I don't think that they state this necessarily and assert this issue. I think that they are really saying, that they don't want to say that out loud, and so that they really just sort of keep it to themselves, and they may just say, I'm busy, or I have a family commitment that I can't no longer work on this project or on this board. So I think it's it does have a climate effect. I do want to talk about a personal component of this. As I transitioned from a civil rights background to the anti-poverty world, I really struggled. And it wasn't because my colleagues weren't terrific and weren't doing terrific work, but it was just a curious situation for me. After going from coalition meeting to coalition meeting, I would be the only person of color in attendance who was actually working on advocacy. And it really, it stayed with me, and I really struggled with it. And I think the bottom line was that my expectation was, because people care about progressive issues in this industry, and because people work on behalf of their clients so diligently, and so putting their whole life's work into it, that it was very hard to understand how the persons doing the work were not of racially diverse backgrounds. And of course, as I said in the beginning, there are some organizations that are very diverse, but then there are some that are not. So I will say that from a personal level, I really struggled with this dichotomy in the industry. And I will also say that I think if I had not been in a leadership role, I may not have stayed. I may have left, but I feel a responsibility to try to work on this issue, and I have been lucky enough to find lots of folks who are interested in this issue, and I think that is one of the reasons why I continue to enjoy my work, because I know that we are being proactive about this and working towards more diversity in the industry. But I really think if I had been a younger staff attorney or new to the industry without the civil rights background, I don't know that I would have stuck it out. I think there are a couple of, or a few things we should just sort of note when we're talking about racial diversity in LSDs and other legal anti-poverty organizations. Racial justice on behalf of our clients, but not within our organizations, is really, they just don't connect. I think if we are preaching to a government agency, or not preaching, but advocating on behalf of our clients that they should be included in decision-making processes, or that they should receive certain services, and our clients are predominantly persons of color, if we don't have diverse staff, there's some kind of disconnect there, and we're really not practicing what we preach, and I think it lessens our ability to make good arguments on behalf of our clients. I think one observation that I have made in the industry is that when organizations are not diverse, they reference their work with community partners. And I think that's great, and you absolutely have to have community partners, but I don't believe that that's a substitute for racial diversity within an organization. I think you must have both to be able to do the work as effectively and with the best results possible. I think in organizations we see racial diversity in terms of sometimes operational positions in an organization, community organizing positions on a staff, but not necessarily to support advocacy efforts. Perhaps the attorneys are not diverse, or the lobbyists for an organization are not diverse. And I really think it has to be across all of those industries, or all those sections of the organization, for it to be fully effective. Part of this session is to talk about solutions and steps towards increasing racial justice work. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the difficulties in recruiting persons of color within our industry. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I think it's where I often hear folks start and stop a discussion is that they will say, oh, we've tried to have recruit minorities, but they leave for better paying jobs. And I think that we really have to examine that statement very closely and not stop there. I think I look at my own friends and colleagues, and I know plenty of folks who are persons of color who are working in civil rights organizations or public defender offices or other similar entities, and making really about the same salary as the legal aid community. And I know that varies from region to region, but I certainly think that's applicable in certain components of the Chicago market. So I think that that's an area where we can go to recruit more. I think if we cast ourselves more as the other civil rights work, I think we would attract more young lawyers, or even, as I'll mention in a moment, laterals. I think it's really important to open our intern and volunteer pools. I consistently observe the practice of hiring folks from who have worked for sister organizations, and that being sort of we know that they do good work, and so we trust it and we can hire that person. And I really think we have to be more open so we're not missing people who might really do great work for our organizations. I think we have to initiate projects that are of interest to persons of color. If your organization does not, in their descriptions of work, talk about persons of color or the projects that benefit persons of color, I think that's a turnoff to lots of folks who might normally think of the industry as an option. I mentioned perhaps looking at other civil rights organizations and criminal defense firms to consider laterals. I put myself in that category. I think I was ready to do more public policy work, and I think I'm not alone. I think there are other people working in civil rights that might be willing to make a step to another agency or a different kind of work. The other thing that I observe is that people are looking for lifer candidates, that they want people who will commit to the organization for the long haul. And I think that markets have changed in this regard, and I think if you think about it differently and you think about having people on your staff for 2 or 3 years at a time, and that's by design, it actually may contribute to your racial diversity and actually better outcomes for your clients and overall make you a stronger organization. And just to wrap up, I think critical mass is crucial. When you have a class of students coming in, maybe as new lawyers or new lawyers coming into your organization, if you have more than one, if you have a few, I think that builds trust in the organization, and then that builds upon itself. In the next class, you might have even more folks who are interested in coming in and that you are able to hire. Again, I will mention racial diversity at all levels, particularly at the leadership level. I think it's very hard for staff attorneys to actually suggest and bring forward issues about racial diversity when they're new hires and really worried about their job security. And again, practicing what we preach for our clients, that we do that internally as well, that it should be an inclusive environment. And now I'll turn it over to Bill, who will talk about the Race Equity Project.
Thank you. Let me see. There we are. Okay, is this working now for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, you can see the screen.
That's
okay.
Good.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try and cut a few minutes off of my presentation so that we can have discussion. But let me first start by saying that the results of the survey certainly gave me pause, and I think are a matter of concern, but frankly not surprising. And I wanted to share with you some of the things that we've done to try and understand how this could happen, how race could be taken off the table in our advocacy. So I do want to say that 10 years ago when we started the Race Equity Project, it was largely as a result of the seminal articles written by Camille and the edition that was published in the Clearinghouse Review that basically challenged us to put race back on the table. And I think in our program, what we had seen is we have a number of advocates who have actually began their careers filing Title VII suits, equal protection claims, due process claims on behalf of our clients. But over the years, over the decades, the defense bar made these cases very costly to the point that individual cases could no longer be brought. Also, in 1996, they took from us the ability to file class action lawsuits, which really reduced our effectiveness at raising race claims in our traditional work. But a change happened, and many of our advocates forcefully argued that we could achieve the same remedies without raising the issue of race. And for some reason, there was not enough pushback on those issues. So the first thing that, looking internally about how we got to the point that we did before we launched the Race Equity Project, pushback from the defense bar, making cases too expensive, restrictions from legal services was the first cause. But there was a second challenge we had to confront, and that was not internal, it was external. And in the public, a fierce allegiance to the colorblind paradigm essentially took race off the table in public discourse. Now, we know cognitively that if we don't talk about it, it's not important. That is what essentially happened. We did not talk about race. You were charged as a race baiter and shouted down if you tried to raise the issue. But because the erosion of commitment to a race-conscious practice was gradual, it was hard to see how dramatically we had changed over time. There was nothing flagrant, nothing dramatic, just an erosion that was caused by the slow grist of time grinding away at us. And I think what Camille's article helped to do was throw a little bit of water in our face and help us to realize that this is not what we signed up for. This is not who we wanted to be. So for us, we wanted to look at our service area and look at the data. We have a very large service area. In fact, it's the size of the state of Ohio. It's a mixture of urban and rural communities. And I think one of the first things that we realized was we needed to do a demographic analysis of the poverty population that we were charged to serve. I think too often we define our communities by the people who walk through the front door. And we have to understand that that is just a part of the population we're charged to serve. So we wanted to do a demographic analysis and use our CSRs and find out where the people we were serving came from and where are the pockets of poverty and the communities that we are not serving. So an examination of that data revealed some shocking facts. First, America was resegregating, and it was resegregating fairly fast. People of color, but particularly African American people, were being separated from opportunity geographically, economically, through our educational system, and politically. And those gaps were growing over time. From the early 80s until the mid-2000s, what we saw is a widening gap separating people from opportunity. We did a demographic analysis of the poverty population, and we found that whites in poverty had significantly more access to jobs, quality education, and housing. So I want to show you a series of slides, and this is a sample. We did this in our entire service area. We used slides to find our poverty population. This sequence, when we ran up against people who said, it's poverty, not race, they're the same thing, addressing one will address both, I think these maps helped us to understand that that wasn't true. First of all, this is a map of the city of Rockland. What you can see is the lighter areas are the more affluent areas, and it's shaded to the darker areas. So we see this area in the middle and this area here as being the most poverty-stricken areas. So we then wanted to see where poor people lived by race in this city. So we first did a map, a dot map, showing where white people in poverty, this is only the poverty population, where do white people in poverty live? Well, this is sort of a shotgun example. They live, in fact, in every district. There are fewer of them in the more affluent districts, but they are represented everywhere. Where do Asian people live in poverty? Well, they live in fewer districts and seem to be concentrated in this area here on the eastern end of Rockland. Where do Latinos live in poverty? Again, concentrated, but not certainly not as widely dispersed as the white population. And then finally, African Americans in poverty. 100% of them live in the most in the poorest part of town in the city of Rockland. Now, this is an example of the maps that we made in cities throughout Northern California and counties throughout Northern California. And it resulted in, others were similar, perhaps not as stark as Rockland. Rockland, where 100% of African Americans live in one district, the poorest. While they aren't all as stark as Rockland, they're all consistent with that. So, again, moving on, that led us to start the Race Equity Project. And to do that, we understood that we wanted to create, refine, and disseminate tools of a race-conscious practice that could be used in any substantive area of law, from housing to healthcare to family law. We wanted the tools to go out to our staff and let them use these tools to help influence their practice and make a more racially conscious practice. We deliberately decided not to create a specialized unit to address race issues. That seemed to be fundamentally at odds with what it is we're trying to do. So the tools are, we needed to understand social cognition and its impact on the intent doctrine. What we found is that cognitive scientists have told us convincingly that what we're asked to prove in cases, civil rights cases, about the intent and animus is just wrong. That's not the way bias works in the human brain. We also needed to take ourselves away from the perpetrator-victim model to understand that racialized structures in fact perpetuate separation of people from opportunity along racial lines, even though you cannot identify a racist. We developed racial impact statements, of which there's an article in this this issue of the Clearinghouse Review as one means to get to that. Mapping and graphic presentation of data are very important. This is often overlooked, but it gives you a new lens and a new way of seeing race in a way that opens up opportunities. So not everyone has to know GIS mapping, but everyone can use Google Maps and other online systems to graphically present the separation of people from opportunity along racial lines. Cognitive framing is one of the tools to help you focus your message, understanding that in those milliseconds between perception and cognition, we can in fact affect the filters so that people are more likely to listen to our clients. The implicit association test and debiasing. Internally, our programs need to understand that you cannot deal with bias in the program without first acknowledging it. The way you acknowledge it is by uncovering it. The implicit association test and debiasing is one way to do that. Finally, community lawyering. We have to stop defining our clients by those who walk through the front door. And we thought that we had to structure our practice so that our clients, our staff could be out in the community. And I'm going to stop right there. I do want to say that our effort is not perfect. It's ever evolving. We have as many mistakes as we do have victories. But we have written about every one of these tools in Clearinghouse Review over the past 10 years. And this issue I'm particularly happy about because it, in fact, encompasses, I think, a comprehensive view of where we are now in dealing with race in legal services practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Now, Camille, Bill, and I are just going to have an opportunity to have some discussion about the content of the program thus far. I want to start with a question about framing. Camille, in terms of working with LSE-type organizations, what suggestions do you make about the framing conversation?
Well, we talked a little bit about this when we were preparing, and one of the things that I think it's important for us to realize is that this issue of, questions like why are people poor, and what impact does racism have on poverty? What impact does poverty have on racism? However, we have deeply held beliefs that we may or may not be aware of, and it's important for us as a community, for us as teams, as organizations, to actually look at that and say, well, what do I believe about this, and not assume that I believe the same thing as my team member or my partner or my, or other folks in the organization. And I was having this conversation actually with some folks who are trying to do work in strategic advocacy, and really understanding where our beliefs are similar is really important. So about framing, one of the things that I mentioned to Bill was that we can't assume that our community shares all the same information, that we're coming from the same perspective. We really need to put the data, put the research out there, and engage people in a conversation about what the root causes are and why the strategies that we're choosing are the right strategies or need to be addressed. And Bill, I don't know if you want to add to that, because the concept of framing, we use it more externally, but I think we also need to think about using it internally.
Well, that's absolutely true. Framing is a lens, and it allows us a method of evaluating issues. For example, we can look at racial disparities through the frame of perpetrator and victim, but that has us on a relentless quest to find the racist. It's not that racists don't exist, but we have institutions that continually put out disparate outcomes where you're not going to find a racist. And so therefore we have to have a different lens, and that lens is structural racialization. We have to identify racialized structures. That is the frame that helps us internally to understand what we do. And new frames and new lenses create new opportunities. And I think that that's one of the lessons of framing. Of course, we as advocates need to learn how to use frames to convince the triers of fact, the communities, of the wisdom of our position, and we need to learn those techniques. But we also need to turn that lens back in on ourselves.
Bill, we have a question from one of the participants asking for some examples of the Race Equity Project, some examples of the work where you have been able to look at some racial implications or issues in your cases. So can you give some brief examples, one or two of those?
I will give you one that was actually quite surprising. Whenever you launch a new initiative, you never know whether it's going to work. So especially one which is decentralized, where we put the tools in the hands of frontline advocates. And I will tell you that we didn't know whether people were actually going to use them until one of our advocates in one of our rural offices called, and he said, you know, you asked us to ask these questions about the data with regard to the way different programs use, address issues of race. Anyway, this advocate came back, and he just asked the question, which he had never asked before, to the county: how much money do you spend on fee-for-service Medi-Cal by race? Immediately, the county had that data. They've had that data every year. They report to the state on that data. And what it showed was they spend $4,400 per year for white registrant in Medi-Cal, which is California's Medicaid program. They spend $2,200 for African Americans, $1,800 per year for Latinos, and if you disaggregate the Asian population, even less on new immigrants. Now, there's an example of something that we never would have uncovered had we not given the tools and the permission to ask. Now, that led to a great advocacy project, which ultimately never came to a lawsuit, because the data alone was so embarrassing that we got an immediate change and outreach, and by now they're closing that gap, and it's actually quite, there's almost parity in the amount of fee-for-service payments. So that's one example, and probably we don't have time for others, but in the article that we published in Clearinghouse Review that is out now, there are 6 other examples, I think, that would show how it came in 6 different areas: healthcare, housing, education, and environmental justice. 6 examples exist in that article.
Okay, thank you, Bill. There was one other question I want to quickly answer from the participants. Someone asked, how do you recruit when you're in rural areas? It's very hard to attract diverse racial candidates. I would suggest that if you think about those projects on a more, or those hires on a more short-term basis, like a fellowship, a 2-year period of time where you're bringing somebody in, and that might create turnover, but if you cast it that way, I think people might be more willing to travel to rural areas. I know there are some organizations that have been very successful in rural areas in attracting folks because of the work that they do, The projects are so interesting that they don't have trouble actually recruiting from the law school. So I think it's a combination of describing your work in a way that makes it extremely interesting and engaging in really important projects, and then maybe talking about it in shorter time frames, 2-year stints where people are coming in and out. We want to turn this back over to Marcia so that we can just touch on some of the highlights in the racial justice special issue for Clearinghouse Review.
Thanks. So yes, just quickly, thanks everybody for joining us again. We do hope that this dialogue will continue. I did want to just, oh, wait a minute. There we go. Show a little bit about what's in the current Clearinghouse Review. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, we have an introduction by Thomas Syons of MALDEF. The article that Camille discussed that she co-authored with Fran Fajana, Advancing Racial Equity, a Legal Services Imperative, will be also on the webinar archive page. You can get that here. If you don't subscribe, there's no charge for that. Structural racialization, Bill mentioned that. Many people are familiar with John Powell's work. He's written on that. The racial impact statement article that Bill mentioned, he co-authored with 2 others from his program. You can get more examples there. One of the new wrinkles in 21st century racial justice advocacy, of course, is the intersection with immigrant rights. There's a really interesting article by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights on their efforts to merge those silos within their own organization. The intent doctrine and implicit bias. This is fascinating stuff that advocates are starting to use in chipping away at the intent doctrine, how the brain works on these issues. We have that. Mapping also, as Bill mentioned. We have several articles that discuss racial justice angles in typical legal aid issues, healthcare, education, housing, and one particularly interesting one about how racism shapes welfare policy. We have 3 case studies of programs that are using racial justice advocacy. Again, the Racial Justice Training Institute will launch next year, so do keep your eyes out for more information about that. Again, the archive should be up tomorrow, as well as it will include that article and panelist bios, as well as a link to the survey results that are now, I believe, up on the NLADA website. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening in. And you'll also receive a survey. We're very interested in your reactions and responses to today's webinar. And with that, I think we'll close.